So the person who handles this request is not available at the moment. Would you mind calling back later on today?
They are the lords of Hollywood for the most part, and they yield a lot of power. And God forbid you should buck that power, you will immediately be labeled as being anti-Semitic and not part of the crowd, the in crowd. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, the person who we're trying to reach, they're currently at lunchtime right now. Can you go ahead and call back a little after 2:30?
Movies are just entertainment. You know, don't take it too seriously. That is one of Hollywood's big lies.
Yeah, they're still not back from lunch.
Nepotism is hiring someone because they're family. Cronyism is hiring someone because they're friends. Favoritism is hiring someone because based on some arbitrary factor that you favor.
Well, it's just simply that we cannot accept unsolicited material.
What would be the reaction of many people in Hollywood today if all of a sudden we said, you know, 60% of the upper management in Hollywood and the top level executives are Christians? What would be the reaction to that?
So you're with Matrix Productions, correct? And you're doing an interview on Hollywood.
Again, as Ben Bagdikian says, media power is political power. Thus, the mainstream media is, to a greater or lesser degree, dictating the politics of the nation. The Second Amendment and Israel being two major examples.
The mainstream media does dictate the politics of the nation by giving the American people a false choice. You must support only the Republican candidate, the anointed candidate, or the Democratic candidate, and very often they're much the same. So for example, they'll shut out someone like Ron Paul, who wanted to go back to free market economics, limited government, states' rights, a limited false choice. You're not given the libertarian or the more constitutionally based alternative. The difference between Barack Obama and George Bush when it comes to their destruction of the Bill of Rights is almost indistinguishable.
There's a certain amount of friction between the two, but in the basic question of how the political structure in this country is supposed to run and who's supposed to control it and what is considered to be within bounds and out bounds, they agree essentially 100%. Because they're all essentially in it together. Big finance, big media, big politics. They're all part of the same operation.
If this is true, the question arises, in a democratic nation, is it acceptable that a small group of executives, any group of executives, not just liberal executives, secular executives, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim executives, are able to dictate who we the people vote for? If the answer is no, then these things should happen. 1. The conglomerates that own, influence, or dominate hundreds of alter ego media companies across America should be broken up through Sherman antitrust laws already on the books. 2. The narrowly defined group of executives that comprises the control group of the conglomerates, networks, and studios should be encouraged to diversify. 3. The Internet must be kept free, open, and universal, and no control group, no matter what demographic, must ever be able to influence or dominate it.
The Internet is really our last best hope for free exchange of uncensored information. And if it's to remain that way, it will become the primary weapon to break the grip of the collectivist New World Order. The one thing that these people fear the most, or maybe fear at all, is the continuing expansion of the flow of information and the ability for the average person to break away from mainstream media and dig out information on their own. I think that is the thing that they must guard against at all costs. And we see a lot of maneuvering going on right now so that the powers that be can control the internet in the name, of course, of fighting terrorism and fighting crime and child pornography and all these other things that are offered to get us focused on the concept that, yeah, it's a good thing to have control over the internet, not realizing that the real goal is to censor political and social information and economic information. The internet is already in the hands of political national and international political forces, and there's a struggle now between American control versus United Nations control over the internet. It seems to be that nobody's really arguing that no one controls the internet. They're now just trying to see which political body is going to wind up with the control, and that is not a very healthy sign. We have to be aware that no one must control content, at least not content, and at least not who participates in the internet. That's our only salvation for a future of freedom.
Again, emphasizing what the Supreme Court said in Burston, motion pictures, and this includes the mainstream media, are a significant medium for the communication of ideas, and these ideas can affect public attitudes about politics.
These anchors and various other mainstream media people are antagonistic to the internet because the internet has taken away their authority and their market share. And so it's only natural that the mainstream media will try to dominate the internet.
And do that regularly now. Also, as part of this equation is the fact that by limiting the amount of ideas that are exhibited, they can limit the knowledge and wisdom and understanding of the viewership.
So if you're running for political office and you do not feel it's in the best interest of Americans to send billions of dollars to Israel every year, weapons to Saudi Arabia, make war in Iraq, or let radical Muslims into the United States, is it okay if the mainstream media destroys your career by labeling you a racist, bigot, anti-Semite, or isolationist?
As someone who ran for president of the United States in 2008 as a third-party candidate, we are not given a fair and free hearing. The American people are not even allowed to hear our ideas. We're not allowed on the talk shows. I don't care whether it's Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. We're not allowed on. They didn't let Cynthia McKinney on. She represented the Green Party. Bob Barr was the nominee for the Libertarian Party. Obviously, there's a lot of libertarians. You have a mainstream elite that are purposely, deliberately suppressing free thought, free ideas, free and open debate. And they are creating a monopoly of ideology, a monopoly of expression, a monopoly of speech, a monopoly of thought.
America went into war in Iraq largely because the mainstream media promoted that war. Did the mainstream media promote the war because members of the control group wanted the U.S. military stationed around the Middle East so it can protect Israel in the name of protecting oil fields?
Well, the mainstream media can impact our viewpoints because we're being bombarded 24/7 with radio and television and cable networks, 24/7 news. And people tend to put this on in the background, or it's playing when you're going through an airport terminal, it's playing on the screen. You're constantly being bombarded whether you want it or not. So you're being hit with a drumbeat of, well, here's the accepted opinion, and you're not being shown alternatives. So it's always you're being hit with, here's how you should see the world, here are the solutions you're limited to, here's the right way to think.
If one reviews a cross-section of studio movies, they can easily observe that Hollywood has a very cozy relationship with the U.S. military. The military, in fact, pretty much allows the studios carte blanche with its equipment and logos. Tanks, fighter jets, submarines, FBI, Signia, all over the actors' blazers. Given these subtle quid pro quos, Hollywood and the New York networks could very well be influencing the U.S. government in ways voters may not approve or in ways that benefit globalist interests over American interests.
The internet is basically the absolute free flow of all points of view in the civilization. Anyone and everyone can represent their viewpoints, opinions, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices over the internet.
How often is some pundit or anchor up there blindly praising Israel? How often do you see fossil fuel burning cars advertised? If the car companies and the oil companies did not dominate the advertising revenues of the mainstream media, maybe we would have seen the development of electric cars like the Tesla, EV1, and Volt much sooner. Also, if the fossil fuel industry didn't dominate the mainstream media, maybe we would have much more enthusiasm and information in the public domain about alternative energy sources like solar and fusion.
We have the sum collective of human knowledge on the internet. And so the mainstream media is either going to become more like the internet or the internet is going to become more like the mainstream media. If the internet becomes more like the mainstream media, we'll start to limit the information and discourse that can be on the internet.
Many people do not understand that if solar and fusion technologies were perfected, we would solve Earth's energy problem. 1 gallon of water, when fused, is the equivalent of 350 gallons of gasoline. We thus have enough water on the planet to provide for humanity's energy needs for over 1 billion years, and solar is just as potent.
I'm not globalist, definitely, but I think there's something what must be done in that direction where we can share this energy what God gives to us. And energy is God's gift, and nobody have no right to sell it.
Of course, the mainstream media tap dances all around these issues while we spend $560 billion a year on war-related defense and interventionist foreign policies.
8,000 Americans total, altogether with these wars, spent $4 trillion, increased the national debt, 40,000 people injured, hundreds of thousands needing medical care. Before 9/11, we were spending $40 billion on security. And now it's over $80 billion they spend on it, and the Department of Homeland Security is expanding and TSA is expanding. So they've done everything completely wrong.
It's so bad the U.S. empire now has 900 military bases in 140 countries. This includes battleships and tanks peppered around Arab holy lands, ostensibly to protect Saudi oil, the very oil that makes their occupation of the Middle East possible. And Saudi Arabia, who gets much of this protection for free, is supposed to be our friend, at least according to the mainstream media's oil and car advertising clients. Yet 15 of the 19 hijackers that ostensibly flew jets into New York buildings and the Pentagon were Saudis. Yes, the mainstream media gets billions in ad revenues from big oil and oil-burning car companies, so there is no way it can truthfully report on the relationship between the king of Saudi Arabia, the people of Saudi Arabia, and we the people of the United States.
So why do we have endless wars? We went into Desert Storm in Iraq under a United Nations resolution. We went into Iraq again the second time under United Nations resolution. We're in Afghanistan today under NATO, another subsidiary of the United Nations. So why do we have endless wars? I've just explained to you. What's the answer to it? Get out of the United Nations and never go to war except with a declaration of Congress. And a congressman from Texas stood up and he said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. It was Ron Paul of Texas. He said, my motion is that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my own motion because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But we should not ignore the Constitution that says no war unless there's a declaration of war. And the International Relations Committee voted 45-0 against Ron Paul's notion. So is our foreign policy all upside down? Yes. What should the foreign policy of the United States be? George Washington said, commerce with all, entangling alliances with none.
Again, the war on terror has not only cost the American taxpayer $5 trillion, and the deaths of 3,500 Americans, it's destroyed the lives of millions of innocent Arabs, Muslims, Afghanis, and Iraqi people. To this, fans of Hollywood movies and the New York media's hit TV show, The War on Terror, simply slouch back in their couches and think, so what? Arabs, Muslims, Afghanis, and Iraqis are the bad guys.
You're doing an interview on Hollywood and you wanted to see if he'll shoot a 1 hour segment.
So the hit TV show, The War on Terror, keeps the oil and Israel lobbies protected, the military-industrial complex fat with contracts, the drug companies spending on TV spots, and the control group execs rich with some of the biggest paychecks in the world. But who is the executive producer of the show? Easy. It's the Federal Reserve System. The guys that print up the Federal Reserve notes to pay for the guns, bullets, tanks, drones, executive salaries, TV ads, and oil.
It would be impossible to go to the taxpayers of any nation and say, well, we're going to have a war now, a war on terrorism or a war against another country or any kind of a war. So starting next month, everybody has to kick in another 8% of their income, thank you. Well, there'd be a tax revolt overnight. The only way these wars and these great expenditures and these bailouts and all this legalized plundering, the only way that can be done is if the money is created out of nothing, which means it's fiat money. Because without the Federal Reserve, without the ability to create money out of nothing, there would be no way for any of this to be financed.
Bear in mind, the Federal Reserve is little more than a cartel of elite bankers that are based in New York City, right down the street from conglomerate headquarters and the United Nations, global headquarters for the one world totalitarian government now under construction.
So it's very easy for that system to finance essentially any expenditure that the government wants to engage in. The other way to finance warfare is through borrowing. But as soon as the government comes into the market and starts borrowing, it drives up interest rates. As the expression goes, it crowds out the ability of other people to borrow, and this has economic effects. What's the percentage of the Pentagon budget, military budget in this country? It's about 50% or slightly more than the total budget of the country. Could that really be financed by taxation and borrowing in a free market system? Would the people be willing to pay those levels of taxes? And would the market be willing to accept those levels of interest rates? Doubtful.
Yes, the Federal Reserve System is using unconstitutional fiat currency to fund the globalist agenda.
It is the fact that the Federal Reserve is the facilitator. But you couldn't have big government. If everybody loves big government, love the Fed, because they can finance the wars and all the welfare you want. But it doesn't work. It eventually ends up in a crisis.
That's right. The media control group ignores the Fed's violation of Article 1, Section 8 and 10 in order to facilitate infringement of the Second Amendment.
Well, you know, the Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And a number of years ago, I actually came up with a t-shirt that said, "What part of infringed don't you understand?" And I was asking that to all the lawmakers in the country who pass gun control laws, because it's not that hard of a word to get. So I looked it up, and the synonym that I really like the most with infringe is hinder. You can't hinder my possession of firearms. Do background checks hinder my right to keep and bear arms? Do waiting periods hinder my right to keep and bear arms? Do all these other regulations about what kind of gun you can own, how much ammunition you can own, and all these other 20,000 gun control laws in this country now, do they hinder the right of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms? Absolutely they do. They're all unconstitutional. They're all infringements. And let's be real clear here. We're talking about the supreme law of the land. The Bill of Rights is the supreme of the supreme laws of this country. Gun control in the United States of America is against the law.
We covered how the Second Amendment guarantees a free state in a movie called Moulin l'Abbé. This movie was totally ignored by the mainstream media, yet features Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan in it. Then, in a movie called Midnight Ride, we covered how a police state could develop if the Second Amendment is infringed beyond a certain point. This movie was also ignored by the mainstream media, even though it was based on the research of one of the foremost constitutional attorneys in the country. And early on, we made a movie called Fiat Empire. This documentary explains why money must be redeemable in gold or silver and why the Federal Reserve System violates the U.S. Constitution. Fiat Empire also was ignored by the mainstream media, even though it earned a Telly Award.
Well, the power of the purse and the power of the sword is important. The power of the sword, I would assume that when you have a right to national defense, and the founders recognized that, that was one limited authority that they did get. But the power of the purse is to restrain those people who abuse it. If the president does too much and fights the war that is undeclared, the people, through the Congress, should restrict that by taking the money away from them. My question is, Mr. Chairman, whose responsibility is it under the Constitution to manage monetary policy? Which branch of government has the absolute authority to manage monetary policy?
The Congress has the authority, and it's delegated to the Federal Reserve. That's a policy decision that you made.
Yeah, but they can't transfer authority. You can't amend the Constitution by just saying we're going to create some secret group of individuals and banks. That's amending the Constitution. You can't do that and all of a sudden allow this to exist in secrecy. So the founders made an attempt to keep the power with the people, and the most important body would be the Congress, especially the House of Representatives. They can stop all this. Only the House is supposed to legislate tax bills and spending bills, not the President and not the Senate. So this to me is a power that we've been neglecting, though, because the President does what he wants, and once he gets involved in a war that it shouldn't happen, I said, yeah, he shouldn't have done it. But we can't desert the troops. A patriotic person can't say, bring the troops home. So they play on that, so they stir up the trouble, and then they use those arguments to get the money that they need. But the power of the purse should be the ultimate weapon against this government power.
So here's the conclusion. If a documentary does not support the globalist agenda, if it is not partisan, if it does not fit neatly into the demo-publican football game, then it does not get funded or promoted by the mainstream media.
Why isn't the media addressing the findings of an international team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, which finds throughout the World Trade Center dust, what amounts to about 10 tons of material that shouldn't be there. Red-gray chips about 1/16 of an inch long, the ingredients of thermite, set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon, which is designed to be the explosive or the force-inducing expansion of gases in products like TNT. This should not be found in the World Trade Center dust. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. Why isn't the media investigating those laboratories?
This should tell us something. The New York-based networks and the Hollywood-based studios, what we are referring to as the mainstream media, are not looking for truth, nor are they looking after the folks. They're looking to guard their clients' interests, usurp political power, and promote the globalist agenda. Every time there's another mass killing by some nut on Big Pharma's mainstream media-promoted product, predictably the same pundits and same candidates with the same tired arguments come on screen and recite another litany of reasons why right to keep and bear must be further infringed.
The school shootings actually are the rise in the use of psychiatric drugs on young children developing minds. The marketing has skyrocketed. We now have television commercials, and on the commercials they're advertising psychiatric drugs and therefore driving up the demand. And the school shooters, the common denominator is that they've all been on psychiatric drugs.
And I think that it's pretty obvious that without any sensitivity towards it, probably is on pharmaceutical drugs, if not psychiatric drugs. When one considers that the 6 major networks derive billions of dollars in advertising revenue from pharmaceutical companies, is it any wonder that every time after a mass killing, we never get to find out exactly what manufacturer of the pharmaceutical drugs the killer was on? The mainstream media is not looking after the folks without informing the public exactly what drugs are being used when these killers go out there and do their deeds.
And gruesome Hollywood movies that dangerously desensitize those who struggle with mental health challenges. Entertainment moguls don't have an absolute right to glorify murder while spreading mayhem in young minds across America. And our Bill of Rights does not guarantee gun manufacturers the absolute right to sell military-styled, high-caliber, semi-automatic combat assault rifles with high-capacity magazines to whoever the hell they want.
So why is this? And why especially does one never hear the word militia on the mainstream media except in a pejorative manner?
Well, I think the federal government, in large part, and along with the mainstream media, fear of people who are armed and independent and can provide for their own security and who might also be able to resist their oppression. They want to make us like people are in other third world countries where there's the ruling junta and the military beneath them and the police, and then there's all the peasants.
As we explained before, the control group is made up mostly of liberals who are of European heritage. Except for the banking capital of the world, Switzerland, Europeans do not have the right to keep and bear arms. Thus, the concept of a militia system is alien to them.
The power of the sword is the police power inherent in we the people. And we must regain that power by having militia laws in each state.
The second reason is that because the mainstream media promotes the globalist agenda, it does not want to give platform to the practicality of gun ownership or local protection through a well-regulated, well-trained state militia system.
If you're talking about local militia groups, almost by hypothesis, you're talking about separate nation states. And of course, the global system wants to eliminate all national structures. Right? There aren't going to be any borders anymore. There's going to be one great global government and then some, local or regional sub-governments.
It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause.
And then number two, as soon as people function in a militia structure, they realize they are the ultimate political power. They do not answer robotically to someone at some higher level in a removed capital someplace. Ergo, we can't allow the people to have those kinds of institutions. We have to remove those institutions.
They never show the crowd. They never show the crowd. Show the crowd. See, they don't want to turn around. Look at the cameras, they face straight.
So the mainstream media promotes the globalist agenda, number one, because they believe in the globalist agenda, the control group. But I think number two, indirectly, to the extent that they promote ideas that are subversive of popular power, popular sovereignty, local control. The consequence of that is to aid globalist machinations.
The control group at conglomerate headquarters and the globalists at the United Nations all know that were the mainstream media to acknowledge that the highest law in the land stipulates the idea that state militia are necessary for a free state. That would not fit in comfortably with the idea of a global government or a disarmed citizenry.
Increasingly, the attitude of a citizenry toward what their government should and should not do is affected by the movies they see and the television programs they see. And the messages are sometimes subtle in the story that this is how it should be or how it must be. And increasingly, we see police acting in a very violent and brutal fashion. And this is the storyline because they're fighting against very bad people. So the concept is, well, as long as you're fighting against very bad people, then you can also be very bad. And in fact, you have to be if you want to defend the good people out there. This is kind of a subtle message that increasingly we see all the time in movies and television programs. That what we used to call police brutality is now just what police have to do because they're opposing very, very bad people. There's a serious question as to whether or not a free people can even know that they're losing their freedom if their concepts of what is the proper function of the state are constantly being affected by this kind of treatment.
Of course, the control group will always remain armed. It's just the pesky citizens that need to be disarmed, just like they've been disarmed in most other countries in the old world order. Stalin's Russia and Nazi Germany are prime examples.
They want civilians disarmed, that they believe in a monopoly of force for the government. And so the gun control lobby is a wholly owned subsidiary, mainly of foreign, multinational, offshore banks that have already conquered Europe and most of the world, and they're coming in here taking over the United States.
Since movies and news shows mirror the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of their makers, the interests of the control group are that the people should never have guns, let alone a militia. The values of the control group are that gun control is more important than gun rights. The cultural perspective of the control group is that guns were outlawed in Europe's Old World Order. Thus, they should be outlawed in America's New World Order. The prejudices of the control group are that ordinary people are incapable of safely and responsibly keeping and bearing arms, and thus their participation in the state militia system is unwise.
Yeah, I think it's very important that people are allowed to be armed, and some people argue that being armed will increase crime, but there's no evidence for this. And actually, this whole idea of a permit for concealed carry, it's better than not being allowed to own a gun, but it really isn't a solution. Everybody should have this right to conceal it or not conceal it. Ultimately, this provides a safer society, and I think some of these rampages could be stopped in the middle of them. And some of the strongest proponents in Texas came from people they've lost families because nobody was there with a gun that could have stopped some madman.
The astute citizen will see that it's a serious liability to the national interest when makers of movies, the gun control group, do not reflect we the people in our diversity and in our agreement with the highest law in the land, the U.S. Constitution.
Could you give me a little bit more info on what the movie is about?
In this documentary, we've seen why it's important for there to be diversity at all levels of the mainstream media, both in the Hollywood movies, on the nightly news, and in other mass disseminated shows and programs.
A democracy depends upon ideas and people arguing and kicking things around and theorizing, and conspiracy theories flying, and people agreeing or invalidating, arguing and hammering out the truth. So that to the degree the trolls on the bridge to liberty, the control group, truncate the information flow to the civilization, we don't have a complete set of information to make decisions with.
The thesis of this documentary can thus be boiled down to the following simple, if not axiomatic, points. 1. Movies and media are powerful influences on human behavior. 2. Movies and media reflect their makers' interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices. 3. If the makers of movies and media are a narrowly defined group, the movies and media such group will promote will also be narrowly defined in scope. 4. Democratic society depends on an informed citizenry and a wide scope of ideas and solutions. 5. Any powerful communications channel that limits the free flow of information acts as a restraint of trade on the marketplace of ideas.
The free communication of ideas, even dissent, is essential for the survival of a free system. If you can clamp down on the exchange of information, even information that you don't think is appropriate and that you wish didn't exist, if you can do that in the name of the greater good or in the name of decency or political correctness or anti-hate or any excuse that you can come up with that sounds good, you are infringing on the free flow of ideas. You may disagree with the fact that they're wasting a lot of money and that there's a $20 million that just disappeared in $100 bills, and you have a feeling it went to the contractors, and you've got information, and they say, you are an enemy of this country. What are you, for the terrorists? Are you questioning our military, our honorable men in uniform? You need to go to prison because you are opposed to this country. You are unpatriotic. You know, they can come up with all kinds of ways to accuse dissenters of being bad people, when in reality it's just a cover-up for crimes and corruption that are being perpetrated. So because of that reality, we must keep the channels of communication open.
Diversity should thus be at all levels of the mainstream media: talent, crew, executive, and corporate, but especially at the executive level, where creative control and financial decisions are made.
But here's the real question. The real question everybody wants to know. Everybody wants to know in the world, is Hollywood racist? You're damn right Hollywood's racist, but it ain't the racist that you've grown accustomed to. Hollywood is sorority racist. It's like, we like you, Rhonda, but you're not a Kappa. That's how Hollywood's, yeah?
I think the concept that is hard to get across to people is the concept of diversity and a narrowly defined control group. They think that by calling for a narrowly defined control group's diversification, that we are criticizing or invalidating any particular element in that demographic. They think that the call for diversity in the control group is an attack on secular values, liberal values, males, Judaism, or European heritage. They take this as a personal attack that if we say that the control group of Hollywood studios and networks is too narrowly defined, meaning everyone in it, not everybody, but 60, 70, 80% of the 3 top executives are liberal, secular, white, Jewish males of European heritage. We have 5 factors that are exactly the same in 70%, maybe as high as 80% of the people that control the studios and the networks. They think that we're attacking these people, that we're bigoted or biased or anti-Semitic. No, the issue is not any particular thing that these people are, because there's nothing wrong with having liberals and progressives and Jews and whites and people of European heritage in the control group. But when 70% of them, 80% of them are all exactly that, we got a lack of diversity problem, Houston.
Which means this whole no black nominees thing has happened at least 71 other times. Okay? You gotta figure that it happened in the 50s, in the 60s. In the 60s, one of those years, Sydney didn't put out a movie.
When 6 conglomerates are staffed by talents, crews, and executives of any narrowly defined group, we the people will be subject to the interests, values, cultural perspectives, and prejudices of such narrowly defined group.
So what it all comes down to is that we have an industry here, an important communications industry, a communications medium called motion picture, which is controlled and has been controlled for its, 115-year existence by pretty much the same people. A small group of politically liberal, not very religious Jewish males of European heritage. And that lack of diversity at the top results in a lack of diversity in the movies in terms of both people who are portrayed in the movies positively and negatively, and it results in patterns of bias. It came about because of massive discrimination, so thousands of lives have been ruined over the years by those arbitrary choices that have been being made based on nepotism, cronyism, and favoritism and other forms of discrimination. And our democracy is being weakened as a result because of the narrow spectrum of ideas that are being disseminated through motion pictures by this narrowly defined group that controls Hollywood.
the Supreme Court observed that mass media may affect public attitudes and behavior in a variety of ways, ranging from direct espousal of a political or social doctrine to the subtle shaping of thought which characterizes all artistic expression. Given this, we the people and those shareholders who own the publicly held mainstream media corporations should work together to create more diversity in the executive ranks of the Hollywood-based studios and the New York-based networks.
The Supreme Court, I think, was expressing essentially self-evident truth, that the mass media is presenting ideas in all sorts of forms. They can be presenting political theories, political news, political fact. But the point is that motion pictures can go from fact to fiction. And across that wide spectrum, you can have all sorts of political influence. What political theories do you promote? Which ones do you denigrate? Which political facts do you choose to present in the nightly news or in the documentaries? Right? What kind of political opinions do you allow to be expressed with favor, or do you treat with disdain? What sort of fiction do you provide? The good guys have particular political viewpoints, the bad guys have the opposite. And in the long run, inundation of the public with particular viewpoints, whether presented as fact, opinion, or in some kind of fictional mode, are going to have long-term effects. He goes and he looks at the nightly news, and the news tells him, these are the facts about what's going on in Syria or Turkey or Bulgaria or whatever the country may be. Is he going to go himself and research those questions to determine whether that's true, or is he going to accept it, especially when he sees it day after day, night after night, week after week, because some of these things go on for a long period of time. And the same thing with fictional presentations. If the fictional presentations that he sees all take a particularly favorable attitude towards the Department of Homeland Security, towards the National Security Administration, surveilling everyone in the world, and so forth and so on, what is the impression that will be left in the mind of that viewer?
It should now be obvious that were it not for the internet, social media, and the Second Amendment, liberal, secular, anti-Christian, anti-American socialist forces in league with rogue apparatchiks in the D.C. swamp and the establishment political parties would by now have completely overrun the U.S. Republic.
So the more freedom we have, the more liberty we have, the more opportunity we have. You know, we complain about what we hear coming out of Hollywood. And many of the actors and actresses, you know, say things that to many of us are just abhorrent.
Blowing up the White House.
How many actors and actresses, how many people in that industry would be willing to speak out in alternative ways, with alternative ideas, if they weren't worried that by doing so would destroy their career? How many people are sitting there in silence and they're not saying anything? They don't agree with a lot of these things that are going on in Hollywood or the news media or education, whatever it may be. But for fear of character assassination, for fear of losing their job, for fear of being politically destroyed or economically destroyed, we need to give them a free platform that they can speak and that they can express themselves and get rid of this oligarchic dictatorship that literally is strangling the life out of our mainstream institutions and ultimately out of the life of our free republic.
It's clear that over 50 million Americans are now aware of the globalist agenda and its destruction of the U.S. manufacturing base, all promoted by the mainstream media.
I believe that globalization is inevitable, but people are scared of all this change. And what we have to do is to convince them that change can be their friend, and the way to do it is to say, okay, we're going to compete, and we're going to win over the long run.
Did Seattle surprise you?
No. I think I knew there'd be a lot of people there. I was surprised that there would be so many basically creeps there who would try to, you know...
Instigators, you mean?
Yeah, throw rocks through swords. There were just a very small percentage of those thousands of people who were doing this. Most of them were there to express their opposition to some aspect or another of this process of globalization.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
President Clinton, back with more of Larry King Live after this.
It's now clear that rogue politicians, lobbyists, neocons, Zionists, central bankers, and multinational corporations have hijacked Congress to pass NAFTA, GATT, and TPP, all free trade agreements promoted by the mainstream media.
Today, as I sign the North American Free Trade Agreement into law, negotiators from 112 nations are seeking to conclude negotiations on a new round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. A historic worldwide trade pact, one that would spur a global economic boom. I call on all the nations of the world to seize this moment and close the deal on a strong GATT agreement within the next week.
The Constitution is a document to restrain the government. And if you don't obey the Constitution, then you don't restrain government, you expand government. If you look at what's happened the last 100 years, I mean, whether it's foreign policy, attack on civil liberties, or economic policy, it's government intervention, constantly growing, and Republicans or Democrats. It's always more instead of less. And I think basically that it's because they don't follow their oath of office and obey the Constitution.
How would you like to lower the country's trade deficit and balance the payments by giving all Americans and all businesses tax deductions for buying American products and 90% profits going to American companies?
Would that work?
I wonder whether it would even be...
legal?
Yeah, it would certainly, I think, violate some of our international trade agreements, and it might cause others to retaliate against us.
But above and beyond the madness, the one story we should now promote, especially on the silver screen, is the story of liberty. In this scenario, Americans need not rely on imports. America can manufacture its own products. Americans can innovate and develop their own alternatives to oil and fossil fuels. Americans could even develop a free energy system and make all things Middle East a thing of the past. Most of all, Americans in partnership with free enterprise capitalism should limit the U.S. government to a size supported only by the taxes specified in the U.S. Constitution. This is the vision of the founders and their script for prosperity. And it's up to we the people to greenlight this script and shepherd the mainstream media back to nobler pastures, a place where the fruits of liberty can be enjoyed by all, a place where we can make America greater than anyone ever imagined. Now that would be a twist in the plot.